right, good morning, West Coast, good afternoon, East Coast, and good evening to all our friends in Europe. Welcome, I am Lane Nooney, and I'm a computer and video game historian in the Media Studies Department at New York University. I'm also one of the co-founders and managing editor of ROMchip, a journal of game histories, who is hosting today's talk. I shepherd that journal alongside my collaborators and co-editors, Henry Lowood, David Parisi, Soraya Murray, and Logan Brown. Give a shout out in the chat if you're here. And I am so excited to have everyone joining us here today for what is not just the latest in the Twitch talks we host called ROMchip Presents, but also the second event in launching our third annual fundraising season. So who are we and why do we need money? I know we've got a lot of friends and fans in the audience, folks who've heard this spiel many times, but in case you're new to ROMchip, we are an open access, hybrid audience, online venue for the publication of game history. And what that means is that at first, as a venue, we develop, solicit, edit, and publish work across a range of formats. We've got traditional peer-reviewed articles, interviews, oral histories, short essays, and translations. And we deal with everything from video games to board games, analog games, sports, and play. As an open access journal, we have no paywall, no advertising, no predatory publishing model. You don't have to pay anything to read the research published in ROMchip ever. Our authors keep their copyrights. We are trying to model a different kind of future for research publishing. And lastly, we call ourselves hybrid audience because we're creating a big tent around game history, a place where we can have rigorous historical engagement with as many people as possible who want to participate. So our mission is that you shouldn't need a PhD to write for, or interview for, or read ROMchip. And these Twitch talks we do, ROMchip Presents, are an extension of that mission to bring historical work to you through the power of live streaming. This is the second talk in a series we've been hosting for the fundraiser. If you missed out on our talk 2 weeks ago with Cameron Kunzelman, you can catch it on our YouTube. We'll put the link in the chat. And next Friday, February 13th, we're hosting Carlin Wing for a talk on her book, Bounce, Balls, Walls, and Bodies in Games and Play. And all these talks are leading up to our third 12-hour Twitch fundraiser that we'll be having right here, February 21st. Go put it in your calendar. We don't want you to miss it because, folks, we need your support. We are only able to be this kind of radically open access and super inclusive entity because no one's paying our bills besides us. ROMchip is entirely funded by people who love game history. We're proud of our editorial independence, we're proud of the big tent we're creating, and we're proud of the fact that our 2025 audit showed that 90% of our donations go to paying people, not platforms. Our copy editor, our web developer, our freelance writers, our tech specialists. That's pretty damn good ROI. And so our goal on February 21st is to raise at least $7,000. That's a tier 1 goal. And we're planning a whole day of streaming content with folks like Jason Scott from the Internet Archive, Rob Dubbin's gonna speedrun making a game in ZZT with help from the chat, Patrick Lemieux is back on the modular synth, Whit Powell will be playing selections from the Trans Games zine, and so much more. We're gonna be giving out books from UChicago and MIT Press. It's gonna be fun and chaotic and silly, and you're gonna love it. And so if that sounds awesome and you can't wait to join the fun, then I have great news for you, which is that you can help us right now. As of this moment, we are just under 30% of our 7K goal with 15 days to go. Momentum matters a lot. The closer we get to 7K, the sooner we unlock higher fundraising tiers, which makes it possible for us to do more cool stuff. And everyone who donates ahead of the fundraiser gets the early donor perk. It means your name's forever enshrined on our website, and you get a little ROMchip swag. You get a card signed by me, even, in your mailbox sometime over the summer. So if you just want to get to donating, if that all sounds fun, links in the chat, donate.romchip.org. Okay. And with all that out of the way, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Raiford Guins. Bring him on in. So Raiford Guins is a professor and chair of cinema and media studies in the media school at Indiana University, Bloomington. His scholarship is devoted to the critical study of technological artifacts and their complex material lives. Guins is the author of 5 books, including Game After, a cultural study of video game afterlives from MIT Press, and Atari Design, Impressions on Coin-Operated Video Game Machines from Bloomsbury. Guins co-edits MIT Press's Game Histories book series. And fun fact for ROMchip loreheads, he co-founded this journal, ROMchip. But today he is here to discuss his forthcoming book, forthcoming in 4 days, King PONG, How Atari Bounced Across Markets to Make Millions. But there is even deeper lore here, because unbeknownst to many of you, probably, Raiford was my dissertation advisor when I was a PhD student at Stony Brook University. And so in honor of this moment, which is as close as to a roast as I'll ever get, I went and looked up the tenure support letter I was asked to write for him in September 2014. I don't know why a former grad student would be asked to write one of these, but here I went and just peeled off the concluding paragraph. So, what I had to say 12 years ago. At every turn, Dr. Guins has not only kept his hand on the heartbeat of video game history and preservation, but also followed that pulse wherever it's taken him. From the dusty deserts of Alamogordo, New Mexico dumping grounds to underground bunkers at Brookhaven National Laboratory. Dr. Guins' scholarship carries with it an unflagging sense of adventure, and I mean that in the best way possible. He is one dedicated to discovery rather than satisfaction with what he's already accomplished. For all of his theoretical finesse, his work has an engagement with the everyday labor, the movements of capital, both mundane and extraordinary, and the human experience of loss that cultivates an intense presence with its audience. In writing, in speaking, in teaching, even in watching and asking questions, Dr. Guins is always powerfully present wherever he's at, demanding the most of you as a reader, a listener, or a learner. Ray, we are thrilled to have you here. The floor is yours.
My God, do I sound good on paper. Now I'm going to ruin all of that. Thank you, Lane, so much for this and other ROMchippers, if we still use that term, for the invite. You mentioned Big Tent, and I really hope I'm not the freak show. Okay, let me get set up here to share with you. Now I'm going to eventually see myself pop up on this screen, correct? No, okay, so I'm just going to move through. I will say this, and I mentioned this to Lane, and she said, don't worry about it. I am a little nervous about this. Part of the reason is the book's not out yet. I have my author's copy to hand. However, I realize it's a short book, but it packs a lot in. And I often feel in talks like this, there's a lot of, oh, you need to know this before you can know that. So I think the big question out the gate is simply this: why write a book about Pong? Let me ask it this way. Why write a book about Pong given all of this? And this is only one slide in terms of how much has already been written on this game and that kind of early history of Atari. In fact, I would say it's overwritten in so many different cases. So I'm kind of adding. What I've realized I've done in my career, going back to at least Atari Design and with King Pong, and I've never used this word in print before, but I think I've been writing paraquels. I've been trying to look at, I guess you would say, lesser known actors, actors in the Latorian sense, but lesser known actors in relationship to organizations or relationships to phenomenon in general. And I'm not quite sure why I've taken to this model, but I feel there are stories that we can bring to what we already know. And I value trying to add and expound upon and kind of extend well-known stories into different directions. The best example of a paraquill for me is Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. I think this was a fantastic film when it came out in the early 90s. And I realized, Gary Oldman and Tim Roth, two actors I like from the Mike Lee days going back. I'm kind of honored to see my work somehow close to theirs, if you will. I didn't use the term with Atari Design, but I used a term from photography, depth of field. And what I've always found to be valuable about this notion when doing historical writing is that I can give priority to certain objects in the frame. Okay, if I want to change that priority, I can then shift to other objects. The key thing for me is that nothing gets cropped. There's nothing cut, dropped out. It's always based upon how I decide to kind of shift and give emphases on different objects. And I found that particularly valuable when doing an organizational study for Atari in relationship to Atari Design, because I wanted to shift attention away from a lot of those names that often get discussed in relationship to the history of this company. I also wanted to shift attention away from electrical engineering and software development. because I think there are other constitutive components around other design professions, industrial design, graphic, interaction design, and then mechanical engineering, that all played a crucial part in Atari's kind of productization of the various products and services the company would offer. So the question that I'm kind of battling with a little bit is why continue to rely on this paraquill? You know, looking at Jim Rockford, I asked myself, what are the kind of motives that I have for doing this type of writing and this type of research? I'll just share two. This is where I owe a great deal of debt to ROMchip. ROMchip asked, or I don't know if I offered or if you invited, I don't remember, but I did a materials piece based upon my work on the Alexander Smith Nutting Associates collection at the Strong. And I basically was taken by the fact that so much of this album that a secretary composed, kind of cutting out clippings from Nutting Associates and various trades magazines, I was taken by the fact that there were so many blank pages that I came across when researching this. And those blank pages had to do with computer space. So I couldn't read about computer space, but I could read about computer quiz. And that was quite exciting for me. I went there to respond to a question that went there meaning the Strong, to respond to a question that Barry Cates asked me when I interviewed him for Atari Design. Can I name a company before Atari that focused exclusively on consumer in Silicon Valley? In a sense, this piece I did was a response to Barry to say, yes, it's Nutting Associates. It fits the bill. Nutting Associates gets positioned in very particular ways in regards to the history of games. On one hand, it's a bit player in the history of electronic games. It's sort of a company you can point to as an example of a false start in terms of computer space not setting the world on fire. Its existence is maintained in kind of a general history of Atari. It gets kind of a cameo in that story. And again, it's kind of pointed to as an example of incompetence when it comes to how Nutting Associates actually marketed computer space. But there's something that fascinated me about this particular company. And I think there was a question that was sort of in the ether, but it was a question I couldn't actually identify. So what I want you to do is since Valentine's Day is coming up soon, just kind of note this little icon. It's going to come back later. And it's sort of where I finally arrived at what kind of interests me around Nutting Associates. The other sort of, I guess, motive for me was what I refer to as a gift shop epiphany. I was at the Silicon Valley Archive in March 23 to give a talk on Atari design. And I always go to the Computer History Museum just to see if that exhibition, the 2,000 or 3,000 years of computing has changed any. And I went to the gift shop to buy my son a gift. And I thought, man, it's interesting. Here's the prototype to Pong. They don't really have many video game books at the Computer History Museum. And I thought, man, I wonder if there's a book on Pong. Has anybody written a book on Pong? Yes, there has been one, David Kushner. You might recognize that name. He wrote Masters of Doom. He also did a piece that I think is problematic called Sex, Drugs, and Video Games in Playboy, related to the history of Atari. This book is a graphic novel, and it's done in the kind of art style of Tron. And it pits Bushnell and Ralph Baer, these two kind of innovators, entrepreneurial geniuses, kind of at odds with one another, battling to kind of claim that trophy of the founder of video games. This narrative really annoys the hell out of me, to be honest with you. What I've tried to do in King Pong is to make the case that if we start to focus on business strategy and marketing, we realize quickly that Pong was in an entirely different industry that stems back to the 19th century. Whereas the Magnavox Odyssey was creating a new type of consumer product for a market that didn't exist. So if we think about it from the point of view of business and marketing histories, we don't have to constantly celebrate this kind of, I guess, war of wits over the founding of games. The epiphany was that Pong deserves a book. That's kind of how I felt. But what else can be said? What else can be said beyond this well-documented history? Has everything already been said? That's always a question we have to ask when one's starting a dissertation or any kind of article or book. But will I waste your time? Will I waste my time pursuing this project? Where I think I kind of arrived at it was that, like many in this forum, that slide I had with all those books, I've read those. We've read oral histories around the history of Atari and early video games in general. I've conducted a number of my own interviews. And put simply, I wanted to tell a different story about a well-known product and its well-known history. To do so required a different take on the familiar story. You may note I've highlighted the word product. I think in Atari design and in King Pong, I use that word game and product interchangeably. I do wonder to myself if going back 26 years ago, if the word product was used, would we have had all those kind of narratology, ludology debates around games? I don't know. It's a question for perhaps further discussion. But what product does for me is it opens up a much broader ecosystem around business, manufacturing, assembly, design, advertising, marketing, retail, all of these other factors that I don't quite think the word game sort of points in those directions. So product does a lot of work for me and King Pong. So specifically, I wanted to better understand Atari's process of productization, category creation, and marketing positioning. In my mind, at least, these are other stories that are equally significant in terms of shaping the history of games. But in doing this, I wanted to be very careful. I didn't want to say, hey, if we're going to talk about business innovation, well, we can then continue to celebrate the likes of a gifted engineer or a gifted entrepreneur. That was something I didn't want to do. In other words, I did not want a book cover to look like this. This is something I really wanted to avoid in trying to write about a well-known history by trying to shift how we can talk about events that we already know. So this is kind of my launch pad for today, the kind of foundation I'm trying to share with what I've done. Atari's success isn't reducible to a single factor, but multiple. And this story is best told with a blend of business history and strategy, Silicon Valley history, and electronic game history. The book details how Atari's strong product positioning and category creation in the early to mid 70s, first within the coin-op amusement industry and then in home consumer electronics, enabled the company to quickly emerge as a market leader. In doing so, Atari's approach to business solved two problems. The first one, the expansion and transformation of the coin-op amusement industry, and the successful productization and commercialization of technology for public amusement. So in a sense, what the book does is explain how did that occur? How did it happen? And that's what I think this book offers. Just some quick background on this project. I think there may be some graduate students in here who find this interesting, or early career academics who are still struggling with that first book. I was able to draw quite extensively from archives I've already had at my disposal from research on Game After and Atari design. I conducted a round of new interviews in 2023. I wanted to sit down with Alcorn and Bushnell again, plus Peter Takeichi, who was heavily involved in industrial design, and some others, just to kind of focus specifically on marketing. I did a lot of new research at the Silicon Valley Archive, looking specifically at Fairchild, Ampex, and Teledyne, where I spent a lot of time in those collections. Just to kind of show you the labor behind this, the manuscript submitted in August 24, reviews take time, they never come back when you expect them to do, or as Murphy's law predicts, they always come back at a time when you're really busy and you're given like a 2-week turnaround. With those revisions submitted in February 25, the last year has been production. Now, what I want to share with you is something I never expected to do as an academic writer. I wrote this book in a linear fashion. I started on page 1 and ended wherever the book ended. In the past with other projects, I've often prioritized one chapter over another based on access to interviews or access to archives. I think the reason I did this is King Pong tells a story rather than makes an argument. Now, that doesn't say there's not arguments present, but I tried to emphasize the ability to write as a storyteller more so than to just do another kind of academic style of writing. I sort of get sick of signposting. I get sick of lit reviews. I get sick of that sort of omniscient narrator voice that often comes out in academic writing. So I wanted to do something different, and it took me 9 months. I've never written a book that fast in my life, so I'm quite proud of that. So to kind of jump into this, I don't know if this is an epiphany or not, but my wife works in ad tech, so she does a lot of stuff around digital advertising. And what I'm really impressed by is no matter what company she works in, there's always a book club. And her colleagues are often reading new books on market strategy. So I would see these kind of stacks of books around. We share the same workplace. I would often see these, and I kind of made the mistake of opening one time and thinking to myself, wow, this is really pertinent to what I'm interested in. And I got really excited about this. I think in the humanities, we often shun these types of books. We don't like to take these books seriously. We feel they're written in a very hacked type of format. There's lots of blank pages. It's the same idea that just gets restated over and over. I think that's a mistake on our part. Just two examples I'll share. This is obviously Inside the Tornado. Moore's book is well known. I cite this book in the context of today's talk because Moore is one of the few market strategists who actually talks about Atari. The go-to is Apple. Everyone talks about Apple as kind of the example of a successful company, constantly kind of shifting paradigms in Moore's language. But he sort of lands on the VCS when Atari is owned by Warner Communications. And he says, the new consumer product referring to the VCS became overwhelmingly synonymous with the entire category of home video games. In other words, the word Atari was a metonym for gaming in general. And that's a sign of a very kind of active and successful company in Moore's vocabulary. The challenge, of course, is that Moore is sort of late. In my argument, the first paradigm shift, to use Moore's language, goes back to Pong. Pong was so different that it restructured the market, expanding where business occurred, if not elevating the very culture of coin-op amusements, manifest in the 1974 slogan that Atari used to rebrand itself, Innovative Leisure. The second paradigm shift is the turn to consumer markets, with the idea of working with Sears to create the home Pong version. This was another kind of driver that allowed the industry to reshuffle, to reconstruct itself in order to kind of support these new product categories that were appearing on the market. Another key foundational text for me is Play Bigger, and their kind of concept of a category king. And the phrase crowns companies that create, develop, and dominate new product categories. A category king isn't necessarily the first to market, but the innovator of a new category of product or service that then dominates its new category. Coming across that line immediately allowed me to position Computer Space and the Magnavox Odyssey kind of in opposition to Atari's Pong. I found that idea of not being first, but who can dominate and own a particular category to be very useful for my kind of early thinking on this product. And one of the kind of flags of this so-called category king is they don't sell us better, but they sell us different. And part of this idea of selling something different is that there is a solution that they're offering to a problem we may not even be aware we have. They use the example of Uber. They also use the example of kind of bird's eyes flash freezing of vegetables as opposed to canned vegetables. This difference, then, what happens to other companies once this kind of solution's been identified, this difference has occurred? Well, other companies, as you can see here, kind of appear outdated, clunky, inefficient. That too resonated highly with me in relationship to looking at Atari in terms of its competitors. And lastly, the notion of category design, coming from Play Bigger, is the means of creating and developing a new market category and then conditioning the market so it will demand your solution. So with these ideas in hand, I'm able to kind of sort of make claims like this in King Pong. Atari in the 70s epitomized Play Bigger's model by changing the way distributors, operators, and location owners thought about coin-op amusements, how its products would be marketed, sold, and where they would be consumed. So what I want to do is just share kind of 5 cases. These aren't case studies. They're just like, since I used Rockford earlier, it's like I'm kind of on the case, so to speak, right? And these are 5 I chose specifically for the audience here that I think a lot of these will be very familiar to you, but I want to sort of show that little twist that I think King Pong offers. So what you're going to see are slides like this, where I've got a case and a name and a number. In the bold black, these are basically kind of consensual views. So that slide with all the books previously, these are some of the ideas that a lot of authors share about this particular case. Okay, so Ted Dabney, Nolan Bushnell, Al Alcorn, they all met in the same subdivision at Ampex. Bushnell and Dabney played Go on company time. Bushnell pursued the idea of computer space, working with Dabney at Ampex, having seen Space War at Stanford. And Alcorn's training, it's a typo, in the video file division carried over to what he did on the training exercise that Bushnell issued his new employee to do a table tennis game that eventually became Pong. This is stuff that I think we agree on. We know it's very kind of almost common knowledge these days. I'm going to share a lot of takeaways by revisiting these particular moments. There's more to say about Ampex. I think one of the things that struck me when spending so much time in the archives looking at Ampex was that Ampex by the late 60s, when at least Bushnell and Dabney were there, were pivoting into consumer markets. So originally Ampex was primarily creating magnetic-based tape for audio and visual for kind of industrial-grade products that, say, Hollywood would use. Whereas by the late 60s, they introduced a micro series of products priced at between $100 and $200. Now that's much different than what you see here when they released the Ampex Signature 5 in '63 with a retail price of $30,000. By the late 60s, when they would have portable cassette systems for automobiles, mobile cassette systems that people could kind of carry around, and home entertainment systems, these were between $100 and $200. Most importantly, because they were operating in kind of industrial grade products for a kind of industry, now they're moving and turning attention towards consumer. A lot of historians note Ampex as having a sort of brand recognition, if not a brand ubiquity, that cuts across these different markets. So this is my takeaway. At Ampex, Bushnell and Dabney observed that consumer markets can be created for laboratory-constricted computer games. That's referring to Space War on the campus of Stanford as one example, if manufacturing retail costs are reduced. They also observed that Ampex completely dominated the market for professional, high-fidelity audio and video recording equipment. So in other words, I'm kind of looking at a lot of lessons that lessons that formed the thinking of Dabney and Bushnell and Alcorn, and perhaps lessons that in interviews they may not actually acknowledge in certain cases. So that's why the Paracool, I think, is very active in my thinking right now. Case number 2, Nutting Associates. I've stressed manufactured computer space. Bushnell retained the rights to the engineering of computer space, whereas Nutting manufactured, distributed, advertised, marketed, and sold the machines. I think that's often one of the reasons Nutting Associates gets sort of, I guess, lampooned in the history of games. Like they didn't realize what they had, so to speak. And it was kind of a mistake on their part to allow the new formation of Syzygy at Nutting Associates, where Bushnell and Dabney would reclaim what they, or would hold on to what they've done in terms of the engineering of computer space. Now, here's my heart. And this was the moment when I felt, or I knew I had a book on my hands doing this research. Nobody stopped to ask, at least that I'm aware of, why Nutting Associates were in Silicon Valley in the first place, especially in a region oriented not towards consumer markets, nor towards amusement. We know the story about Nolan Bushnell and Dave Ralston sharing the same dentist, right? Ralston worked at Nutting Associates. Nolan Bushnell talks about going to his dental regular annual checkup, hears about this guy in Mountain View who works for a coin-op amusement company, and they connect that way. But nobody's really stopped to think, why was the company even there in the first place? And the origin of that has to do with a very prominent name in terms of Silicon Valley history, and that's Eugene Kleiner. And often when histories around Kleiner or when histories of business and venture capital are told, Kleiner's name has to come up. And The line that often gets drawn with Kleiner is, famously one of the traitorous eight who founded Fairchild Semiconductor. He then went on with other people who left Fairchild to work at Teledyne for a brief period of time. And then by the late 60s, he was an angel investor in a new company called Intel. And then from there, he launches Kleiner Perkins, probably one of the foundational venture capitalist firm in Silicon Valley. But there's another moment that gets left out of. And I've only seen two places in a lot of kind of history of this era that actually mentions edicts. And I've spoken to the authors who have done this. And I think I've kind of noticed they each have allocated a paragraph or two at most around this company. And part of it is that you just can't find much information. This was the only document I actually came across at the Silicon Valley Archive. But it was sort of that moment that I was really proud of, because the dates line up. Eugene Kleiner's name's there. He's writing to his friend Jay Last, who's at Teledyne, Amelco at the same time. And this is a history that I think proves absolutely crucial for Atari's Pong. And it's a history that I would say is kind of invisible in a lot of those well-known histories around Pong. Is that the company Edix was involved in the business of teaching machines in the 60s for edicts, but the kind of phenomenon of teaching machines stretched back to around the mid-1950s up until the mid-60s. There were a number of companies who invested in this sort of new educational phenomenon. Bell Laboratories, Harcourt Brace, Ream are just a few I've mentioned here. Basically, teaching machines would cut across different teaching and learning context. And there were a lot of different types of machines. You'd have these little machines often positioned on a desk or a surface-like space. Some would use film technology, where you would have a little window that would show a question. And then the student, K through 12 college or military or medical, would then input A, B, C, or D in response to the question. It allowed students to work at their own pace, at their own speed. They could advance to the next question unless they answered the question correctly. Also, Raytheon and Edix had this kind of combined kind of teaching system that was outfitted in different sort of educational auditoriums, where you'd have a lectern that could control lights, slide projectors, overhead projectors. And a lot of the teaching machine equipment that students were using would allow an instructor to kind of record grades quickly, and then students would have kind of an automatic feedback on a lot of the work they've been doing. Edix was not in this business for a long period of time. In fact, Raytheon, known better for missiles and microwaves, acquired Edix in 1965, and then Raytheon exited this industry altogether by 1971. And that's why this date was really exciting for me to see, January 17th, 1964, because in 1964, Edix had a subdivision called Scientific Amusement Machine Company, and they only had one product. But I think the product is quite important for the story I'm trying to tell. They had Knowledge Computer. Now, how this happened remains a mystery. From two different sources, what I've learned is that somebody made a joke. I'm assuming Kleiner heard the joke that, hey, put a coin slot on one of those teaching machines. And that's exactly what Scientific Amusement Machine Company did, is it put a coin slot on a teaching machine and branded it as Knowledge Computer. Now, here's where an important name comes into the story, William Bill Nutting. Nutting joined Edix in 1962. He was tasked with marketing and selling of teaching machines. He was the one who took the new product of Scientific Amusement Machine Company to Chicago to the annual MOA convention. He was the one who promoted Knowledge Computer. And I'll draw your attention to the text on the side under the machine itself, opens up new locations. Nutting's promotion of Knowledge Computer identified unimagined markets for amusement machines. And it's very clear when you read this list that they're bypassing those more traditional types of spaces like recreation centers or game rooms. The product's purpose, and they make no bones about this, is amusement, but the experience is highly educational. That combination, at least in terms of how Nutting's trying to market this product, becomes absolutely crucial to not only identify those markets, as you see here, but to also then try to get the product into those markets. The importance there is that there's no competition in these markets because the likes of pinball, bowlers, shuffleboard, kiddie rides, electromechanical machines aren't in these spaces. So they would be able to dominate a market based upon this type of machine. This is a little bit later in 1968. So Nutting acquires the rights to reproduce Knowledge Computer once Edix exits the industry. And then Nutting has a very good product on his hands. You can see the price that Computer Quiz retailed for by the end of 1960 or in 1968. And they were basically $1 million company with one product. It's how Nutting understood his product that I think is really important for this discussion. And this is a kind of a retrospective profile piece. Cashbox would often do these on presidents of coin-op companies. And this is what Nutting has to say. With the large population of the computer generation, he explains, the growing emphasis on knowledge, education, TV quiz programs, etc., a sophisticated educational coin-operated game seemed to have potential. There's a lot packed into this phrase. Computer generation in 1968, what did it actually mean? I mean, we're looking at mini computers, not microcomputers yet, right? So we're looking at a very limited generation that would have access to computers, mostly in business or research facilities. In another version of this, he credits that computer generation as the young people who grew up using teaching machines. So teaching machines have played kind of a very enormous role in terms of how Nutting imagines who the users are for his technology. The role that TV quiz programs play is that in the mid-1960s, we have scandals around TV quiz shows in the US. Jeopardy launches in 1964. In other words, Nutting's taking a popular genre, a popular television genre, translating it into an electromechanical game in public places. So something that's already kind of buzzing and exciting and capturing public interest, he's made it into a game. And lastly, sophisticated. I'm going to come back to this, so I'm just going to give you one example of how this notion of sophistication worked at Nutting Associates. This is a close-up of Computer Quiz, and any Nutting staff members, employees who would staff booths at conventions were given a script where they would compare the face of Computer Quiz with IBM's big, the nickname of IBM, Big Blue. In other words, they referred to their color hue as IBM Blue. And part of the kind of rationale behind this was to sort of visually connect Nutting's product with the products of IBM, celebrated for their elegance in terms of industrial design, but also their sophistication in both form and function. So this was a way that Nutting could kind of achieve a certain sense of sophistication by using the rhetoric of IBM to help promote the selling of a quiz-based game in the industry of coin-op amusements. This is just an example to show you how Nutting just kind of carries over what he did with the Knowledge Computer to Computer Quiz. You can see the types of locations that are being mentioned in this context. And I think that key phrase for me, new locations, new possibilities. And here's my takeaway. Sorry, it's hard for me to read the last line. I've got that little share window. I don't know if I can relocate. Sorry about that. See if I can I can't move it. I'll do the best I can. Maybe somebody can help me fill in the gaps. The takeaway for me is that Nutting Associates greatly expanded the market for coin-op products. Access to more locations meant access to more profits. Computer Quiz was intentionally designed to gain access to locations forbidden to other forms of amusement equipment. The case of computer space. As with the audience in front of me today, a lot of us already know about this game, I would say. 2 points. Computer space produced what's known as a false positive in Nolan Bushnell's language. The idea here is that it was tested at a bar close by Stanford. It did quite well, but when it was tested at other bars away from the university itself, it didn't fare as well. It didn't sort of attract more players than, say, more traditional stuff like pinball. And also, the notion that computer space was a false start for a video game industry. A number of reasons are cited for that. They're shared here. Again, I'm drawing from a lot of different sources to kind of create this list: perplexing controls, lackluster gameplay, single player only mode at that time, confounding instructions for players, voluminous instructions for operators. And I think perhaps most importantly is that there's a technical build that is kind of beyond the skill set of a lot of people who would service coin-op amusements in the early 70s. I really like how Noah Wardrop-Froon has kind of added to this kind of list of problems around computer space when he writes, the versions of its operational logics that could be implemented in commercially viable technology cannot support a compelling version of Space War style game design. In other words, it just wasn't that fun to play, right? So put aside all these technical things, and yes, we're going to celebrate it for technical innovation, but at the end of the day, it kind of wasn't as good as Space Wars. So I really like that, the way Noah's added to this list, kind of like piling misery on the corpse of computer space. I've attacked it from a different direction altogether. 3 different points that I think are quite valuable in terms of these kind of paraquel work that I'm trying to do. The singularity of computer space's packaging, and referring to the kind of design of the cabinet, did not urge other manufacturers to adopt similar styles. I mean, why would they? It's not selling that well. And if the standard, more boxy styles for electromechanical games or the standard playfield for pinball works, why deviate if these machines are earning more than this new packaging for computer space? Why change when new markets aren't being created or accessed by the likes of computer space? I've tried to understand this challenge based upon the name itself. And what I mean by that is computer space, like Computer Quiz, is trying to continue to riff off of this idea of the computer generation. Again, trying to distinguish a different type of user for this new type of machine. Computer Quiz made sense when Nutting when it translated knowledge computer into Computer Quiz. It made sense because the intelligence of a computer, although it wasn't a computer, was coupled with the intellect of a coin-op quiz machine. That worked. However, computer space, as I've said here, communicates Space War poorly. Now, at the time, you couldn't just introduce Bushnell wanted Space War as the title. Ralston felt in order to maintain brand harmony, we want to use the word computer in the title. Unfortunately, it doesn't scream out some type of space combat. So perhaps the title, although it may have made sense in terms of brand harmony, but trying to attract users by giving them at least a hint of what the gameplay experience would be like, ultimately the name doesn't work in that respect. And the last one is the notoriety of the game played on a TV screen didn't win over the coin-op amusement industry. And this very much goes back to Inside the Tornado and seeing that there wasn't a shift in terms of the industry that was happening. The screen kind of failed to lure the industry away from other types of displays for game mechanics, so pinball playfields and the builds of different types of electromechanical games. Many in the late 70s, so in late 71, the game comes out in 71 in October, but even a lot of the kind of publications around it, there's a concern that it's a novelty. To have a game played on a television screen. This is not a new market category that's happening, but it's just sort of like a trivial one-off, if not a trend. And ultimately, Nutting Associates did not convince the industry or even players that they needed this new type of game. What type of problem was computer space trying to solve in the market and for people who played coin-op amusements? So I think the takeaway is kind of obvious here. Computer space's shortcomings exceeded its technological architecture to sit squarely as market and product positioning problems. Nutting Associates ultimately failed to communicate its new product category of a video skill game or a video game, even though video game was not a term being used in 1971. No problem was identified in terms of what computer space could kind of solve in terms of the industry itself, and that technological innovation did not translate into an innovative new product. Okay, just 2 more of these. This is 4, then I have, as you'd expect, 5. And this is the case of Atari's marketing strategy. Atari decides to manufacture Pong. I spent a lot of time kind of detailing that interesting moment in the company's early history. 3 engineers from Ampex with 0 experience in marketing and sales. There's another component that we can kind of add to this, and it's a component that Bushnell brings to the conversation of this time period for Atari. He looks back on his former employer, Nutting, says, hey, it's a great learning experience. And he pauses. We couldn't screw things up any worse than they did, referring to the fact that computer space didn't really set the world on fire. In other formats, other forums, usually in interviews, one-on-one, or in public kind of forums, he would then say that Nutting Associates couldn't find their butts with both hands. And also they're a bunch of bozos. So this was something I wanted to kind of test. Were they really? Is that the case? Because ultimately, what I'm trying to figure out is, how did Atari know, given the background of 3 engineers, how to market a product, let alone how to manufacture a product, but how do they know how to market it? What models were they possibly using in order to understand this process? A lot of it hinges around this concept of sophistication. And it's utilized in 2 ways in this time period at Atari. First is the idea that Atari's products, is a misspelling, that Atari's products are state-of-the-art in terms of technological innovation. They're regarded as sophisticated in comparison to the more standard type of equipment, that's the term for coin-operated machines, for equipment that you would get from the likes of pinball manufacturers or electromechanical game manufacturers. It's state-of-the-art, solid state, in that it's more reliable, given all the moving component parts that you would find film magazines, 8-track players, black lights, paper, that you would find in electromechanical games. And this idea of sophistication allows Atari to kind of claim itself as a leader in terms of these new types of games that are becoming more and more sophisticated. But where have we heard this before? Cashbox, February 12th, 1972. What's fascinating, when you read and try to track the launch of computer space in the pages of Cashbox, there's no headlines that says, this changes everything, or Eureka, Nutting Associates has redefined the market. It's actually quite a muted affair. The word syzygy does not even appear. The name Bushnell, the name Dabney does not appear in relationship to Nutting Associates whatsoever. Dave Ralston, who does marketing and sales for Nutting, does something I think that is absolutely amazing. It's such an incredible spin in terms of how he tries to address computer space to the coin op industry in the pages of Cashbox, because he makes it a generational game. And you can see he's playing off Nutting's notion of computer generation still. Young operators and distributors, Ralston believed, understood the potential of computer space, just like the computer generation flocking to Computer Quiz. While those industry dinosaurs rolled their eyes and chastised, and this is a direct quote, "Son, I've been in the business for almost 30 years and the game is too sophisticated." Having that mindset, according to Ralston at least, means that they're not taking advantage of the possibility of new locations. They're out of touch. They're out of date. In fact, this is the spin. Future games will continue to become even more sophisticated, Ralston kind of alerts the industry. The problem isn't sophisticated games. The problem is game industry decrepitude. So he plays the game quite effectively here that positions computer space and Nutting Associates is so far into the future with these new sophisticated devices, the industry has to keep up. Otherwise, the industry is going to fail. So this is sort of, I guess, the warning that Ralston's trying to issue in terms of sophistication is not the problem. Sophistication is a plus. It's something we're trying to move towards and achieve with our products. Now, the second use of sophistication, all of Atari design is devoted to this very concept. So I'm not going to say too much about it, but it's about the importance of packaging, about the industrial design of the cabinet. Pong was able to access markets where other types of machines for amusement could simply not access them. There's a number of reasons for that. It's not ostentatious. There's no graphics. It's short. It's quiet. It's minimal. It's understated. It doesn't take up the same amount of space that a pinball machine would take up. All of these allowed for this game to slot into traditional locations, but also emergent emergent locations associated with hotel lobbies, restaurants, and cocktail lounges. I can't, more places, more profits. That seems to be the winning formula for a game like Pong. Now, this is where I'm building from my takeaway, because what we see here is that Bushnell provided the marketing language, astutely mimicking his former employer's game plan. So the text you see on the Pong flyer, low-key, sophisticated locations, Bushnell wrote that. I was curious who actually wrote the text for the Pong flyer, and both Alcorn and Bushnell, Alcorn pointing to Bushnell, and Bushnell said, I did. What you see that's so kind of overt in this sense is that Nutting Associates established the marketing template of sophistication, and Atari kind of just adopted that as its own kind of marketing strategy to place its products into these emerging markets. So I think Nutting could find its butt really well, in other words. Now, maybe it didn't take advantage of that with computer space, but it certainly sent a message to Atari in terms of how it could understand markets, new emergent markets, and also how to place and position their products into these markets. I have to remind us of Play Bigger and this notion of solving a problem with products and how a company becomes a leader by identifying these product problems and having their products kind of address them. Beginning in '74, Atari did not identify itself as a manufacturer of amusement products or equipment, to use kind of an outdated term, but as a business focused on, and this is very much a mouthful, the application of sophisticated technology to leisure fields. I found that quote in the Desert Sun, February '73. So not even a year into Atari's existence. And they're kind of rebranding, trying to think about, understand what their business actually is. And this reconceptualization of itself and its product category was concretized by the slogan, Innovative Leisure. And that slogan allowed Atari to kind of move beyond its original startup position with one product, and eventually other products came into place. But the takeaway for me is this. The problem that Atari solved was the perception of amusement itself. And they changed the industry by elevating their status as a technological innovator and leader, but also the status of their products as sophisticated, beyond what you would find from other coin-op manufacturers. So amusement itself is kind of positioned as a problem, that kind of decrepit industry that Atari is part of and beneficial from, but at the same time, they're going in radically different directions. Now, the last one I will share with you, and I'm kind of wrapping things up a little bit here, is that clones, or just the role that clones have played in the industry. Two quotes. I'll just read the second one in the interest of time. The first one we just talked about in terms of locations, but the second one is very noticeable. They're both from the same interview that Bushnell did. And you can note the date, not even a full year into Atari's existence. We're really pleased by the number of manufacturers who are trying to copy Pong. It tells us that our product is superior and that the rest of the industry is interested and willing to follow our lead into new markets. So they're kind of really setting themselves up as a leader to be followed in the language of Play Bigger. But Bushnell had another word to describe all of these companies knocking off Pong, and it was jackals. So here's a public face, but here's the private face, sort of accusing these companies of kind of ripping them off. The dates are really important here. We have major news periodicals, Business Week, Time Magazine, Wall Street Journal, pointing to the fact that Pong has become commonplace by November '73, at least according to these magazines. It's become ubiquitous. You can see some of the sales that are being reported, 12 million in sales for this time period. Pong's able to cross over thresholds between the Sausalito Club in Miami, the Marriott Hotel in Los Angeles, plus arcades, recreational centers, but then gaining access into these kind of high-class locations, places that would have never welcomed video games before. Now, the takeaway for me is kind of a very interesting and also awkward takeaway, if you will. The deluge of unlicensed pirated games alongside their prime mover Pong normalized the presence of video gameplay everywhere. Sure, Atari lost profits, but imitating and innovators of the game's ubiquitous, conditioning new markets into acceptance. When I shared this kind of observation based upon the research I was doing with both Alcorn and Bushnell, I have to admit I was kind of nervous to say that, even though you're losing profits, it was still good for your business. I got kind of mixed responses to that, I will admit. But if we simply look at the numbers, there's no way that if Atari was the only manufacturer, that 7,000 to 8,000 total unit sales of Pong could have made the game could have made the game, the product, so commonplace that Business Week, the Wall Street Journal, and Time would be kind of singing its praises as ubiquitous 9, 10, 12 months after Atari's existence. Leslie Berlin cites 45,000 kind of ball and paddle games on the market by late 74. In other words, Atari needed all of these kind of knockoffs in order to make its new product category successful. And I will stop here, kind of riffing off that very last point. Like Atari, many of these jackals specializing in video games with their Pong clone Armada stem from no prior experience manufacturing traditional forms of coin-op amusements. And the bulk of them, ROMtech, Exidy, Gremlin, were based in California, thus firmly associating the West Coast with technological innovation in the amusement industry while shifting attention away from its traditional Midwest home. I think that fits with that kind of industry reshuffle that Moore talks about. Along with its competition, Atari decisively established a new product category, a category that its progenitor would command across the 1970s. That is it for me. I will stop sharing and come back to Lane.
Hey there, are we two up? All right. Hey, Ray, thank you. Amazing. That is
Thank you.
Truly so much content.
I'm sorry, that was my fear. That was my worry.
No, that was amazing. It was amazing. People in the chat are clapping. And cool.
Oh, nice. Thank you. Okay. I need that. I'm so nervous about this project. I need that. Thank you.
So we don't have a ton of time for questions, but I've got at least two that I'm going to share with you.
Okay.
One is like a big kind of chunky one, and then the other is sort of a kind of someone wanting kind of deeper fact knowledge, I think. But first up, Dave Parisi asks, so I love the focus on productization and your provocation at the start that we could have avoided ludology versus narratology and all the associated scarring if we thought in terms of products rather than games. Why isn't this isn't a question as much as a request for further elaborations on the implication of that shift?
God, I don't know if I can, Dave. I just came up with that a couple of days ago. I wanted to be a bit of a shocking provocation, to be honest with you. I just think that the word game doesn't do enough. And I know I've said in the past that game history mustn't only be about games. And I think by saying product, at least my work and my interest around graphic industrial design and other design professions, which was Atari design, I think looking at product, you have to realize there's a lot of different stakeholders and a lot of players that can create something into a product. Game doesn't necessarily have that same connotation. So I think I'm trying to, I guess, situate my research interest into a kind of a broader terrain of business. And I think product is kind of recognizable to those people, who speak that language, whereas game doesn't quite resonate as well with them. That would be my off-the-cuff, immediate, off the top of my head response, Dave.
I mean, one of the things Dave was noting in the chat is how, it is very much in spirit with the kind of argument that like Tom and Braxton make around the Intellivision about the need to kind of understand these as kind of capital forms first and foremost. And I think that my work is also very much trying to get games out. Like when we talk about computer game history, the computer software part is kind of more important than the game part if we want to understand their systems of production, manufacturing, and distribution. I don't know if you want to.
No, I'll just add one quick thing. I have found myself kind of taken by, and I say this in one of the early slides, electronic games. Because we're always, digital analog, right? I don't want to do that. I think electronics sort of resolves that problem a little bit for me, at least. But then again, with ROMchip and with the game history series, we prefer game because we don't want to exclude tabletop or kind of paper-based games, right? We want to be very inclusive in that respect. The only thing we seem not to embrace is sports, but that's a different debate for another time.
Well, wait till we get Carlin on next week, and then we can talk
I'm
about our
looking forward to that.
relationship to sports. So Capcom MDB in the chat had a question. They say, I never paid attention to the lack of graphics on the Pong cabinet. So you found that was intentional rather than owing to a lack of budget for a graphic artist, compared maybe to something like Midway's licensed winner. It was just sort of, I think, a request for sort of more info on that.
Yeah, Atari Design goes through that whole argument. I'm not saying read the book, okay, but you should. What I am saying is that no, there are economic constraints. That's the primary reason Pong looks the way it does. But when I asked Dabney before he passed away, when I interviewed Dabney about, were you looking at, because Dabney was responsible for trying to source the cabinet. So Halbert, I think, was the local woodworker they actually built the Pong cabinet from. But he got that through the sources that Nutting used. And Dabney said to me that, I said, were you looking at anything? He's like, yeah, we looked at Computer Quiz. We looked at how Computer Quiz was able to move into these spaces. So having that cheap kind of particle board, walnut veneer on the side, the reason Pong is short, because that particular cut of wood, if they went like an inch more, was in a different price bracket, right? So there were economic constraints for that reason. Bushnell wanted it orange. Orange would have been a special order. They had yellow on hand, so they went with yellow instead. Those are letter set, just kind of rub-on letters that you see on top of the cabinet. So it's economic constraints. None of them were industrial designers. Atari did not have, there were 3 up to maybe 30 in moving into the early 73, right? Assemblers. But Atari did not have an industrial design division until George Farraco, and I was able to interview his daughters for this book, which I was really excited about. George Farraco saw the phone number on the back of a Pong cabinet and called and supposedly said, that thing needs some help. So then George was brought in to found the industrial design division of Atari. And for about 2 to 3 years, he introduced some radical new ideas, but he also, most importantly, I think, is he hired Regan Chang and Peter Takaichi from San Jose State's Industrial Arts program. So he set up industrial design. He realized that these machines have to look better. I think Atari did what it could. And the fact that those graphics weren't present have played such a huge role in just opening up and getting the foot in the door for new locations. I hope that addresses the question.
I think so. And
I know a lot about wood is something I've realized in my research on video games. I'm more interested in looking at the side of the cabinet than what's on the screen.
And I'm going to ask one quick question. I was interested in your turn toward the kind of marketing text, right, as something to use to kind of figure out what was going on. But it seemed also like a lot of those texts are contemporary, and I was wondering if you've like kind of looked at these kind of branding, marketing, productization through the ideas that were circulating within those communities in the 1960s and 70s.
Oh, I didn't go back to read those types of books for that time period. I kind of retroactively fit these books onto that time period. Yeah, I think an economist will completely call me out for doing that. You're not one, okay, so it's okay. But no, that was something
just a business historian.
Yeah, just that. No, I didn't do that. I did that with Atari Design in terms of reading about the history of industrial design and looking at like ID Magazine in 1971, 1972. I think I did that more with the industry of coin-op amusements than I did with these marketing strategies. And I think that's probably the Achilles heel of the project. But nonetheless, I think some points are still made that can be quite useful for how we think about games. And I will quickly say, and maybe this goes a little bit back to Dave's question, kind of full circle. I'm kind of excited with what I see happening in game history right now. I can point to my colleague Julian Milan's work, who's now put lawyers into the conversation, doing legal histories. I think that's valuable to just kind of bring other sort of stories into how we make sense of the medium. And I just find that these kind of little areas that we keep kind of branching out into really can kind of recoil and bring a lot to our conversations. So I'm really happy. I hope I'm a part of that, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Awesome. Also, Capcom MDB, that's Devin Mowens. He says, wow, thank you. That makes perfect sense, given that they were a small startup, mix of cost, practicality, and design. Yeah. I'm going to wrap this up real quick. If you loved today's talk, You believe in what ROMchip's doing? Here's what you can do next. Head to donate.romchip.com and make a contribution. You can see you amazing people have already gotten us up over 30% during this event. We're over 2K. We're at 2,105 and 50 cents. And every bit brings us closer to 7K. It lowers my anxiety, which is very meaningful to me, so that we can keep bringing open access, independent, awesome work to all of you. Early donors get swag, shout outs on our website. And then secondly, don't forget to mark your calendars and join us for the rest of the season. We're back here next Friday, February 13th, with Carlin Wing on her book Bounce. And then we'll close it out with the all-day Twitch fundraiser on Saturday, February 21st. Subscribe to our newsletter. I'll put the link in the chat and you will never miss an update. Thank you for showing up and see you at our next event. Cody, we out? We are on air. Okay.